So let's get started. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Zach Lisher-Katz, assistant professor here at the School of Information. And I'm going to introduce a very special guest, Dr. Christina Dunbar-Hester. Christina Dunbar-Hester is the author of Hacking Diversity, The Politics of Inclusion in Open Technology Cultures, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, as well as Low Power to the People, Pirates, Protests, and Politics in FM Radio Activism through MIT Press in 2014. She's a faculty member in the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Southern California in LA, and she holds a PhD in Science and Technology Studies from Cornell. She's currently writing Oil Beach, How Toxic Infrastructure Threatens Life in the Ports of Los Angeles and Beyond, under contract with University of Chicago Press, which I'm really excited to read. So if everyone could welcome Christina to a talk, and I'll let you take it away.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much to the School of Information for hosting, and to Zach for the invitation. As he alluded, we were colleagues in a former lifetime for both of us. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but it is nice to beam in nonetheless. So I'll do my best with this affordance and format. And speaking of, I know Zoom is kind of deadly, so I'm going to try to be fairly conversational in how I'm presenting today. Before getting started, I will orient us by saying this is not a best practices talk. It's more like a first principles talk. And my topic is what happens when voluntaristic open technology communities like hackerspaces and free libre open source software projects, FLOSS projects, start to address diversity and inclusion topics. And the architecture of the talk today is I'm going to suggest that this is a somewhat tangled and messy situation. And my plan is to present some of the messiness and then hopefully distill that and lead us out of it a bit. The ideas I want to plant in your head for now are about levels and scales of social problems and what technology might have to do with all of it. I will skip history of these communities, but I will briefly mention some of the norms that undergirded them since their inception. Proponents of free software like to say that this means free as in speech, not free as in beer. And that contains a lofty set of ideas about the freedom of the individual, as anthropologist Gabriella Coleman has discussed. But some would say that free software barely exists, like STS scholar Chris Kelty. This is due to it having been eclipsed in more recent years by open source, more market-oriented version of some of the same ideas. And openness here means code has been left open for modification, more than it means openness to entry by all, but there's a maybe suggestive entailment that's there nonetheless. Again, sort of maybe cueing some thoughts about liberalism and sort of individuals freely associating. Ironically, perhaps, this cultural formation, whatever you might call it, in its early days cultivated milieu where some animals were more equal than others. The commitment to free speech has, at least indirectly, bred tolerance for adversarial behavior. And my research project begins in a moment where this status quo is beginning to be challenged around the turn of the millennium. And to give you an idea of the kind of thing I'm talking about, I have a slide. And in roughly chronological order here, you see Linux chicks, Debian women, Pi ladies overhead, and Pi star, which is an explicitly trans-inclusive version of these kinds of groups that we see forming in these FLOSS communities. And so, as I said, this starts around the turn of the millennium, but it really takes off in about 2006 with the publication of this report. This is an EU policy report, and it studied the constitution of FLOSS communities and revealed that the rate of participation by women was really strikingly low, less than 2%. And while there had been sort of an anecdotal feeling that the rate of participation by women was low, this finding actually really shocked people. It was really, really low, and it was actually far lower than in academic or industry settings. And so this research finding actually sort of galvanized folks into taking up these issues, more explicitly in their communities, such that by a few years later, hopping ahead to 2012, a statement like this one put out by the Free Software Foundation becomes very commonplace. And they write in this blog post, "The free software movement needs diverse participation to achieve its goals. If we want to make proprietary software extinct, we need everyone on the planet to engage with free software. To get there, we need people of all genders, races, sexual orientations, and abilities leading the way." And to contextualize this a little bit, I already said this is by the time this appears, it's a very ubiquitous kind of statement. That doesn't mean it's without controversy, but it's this kind of discourse is circulating very widely. I also want to point out that gender appears first, and that's because it was a lot more represented initially. That does change somewhat, and I take up some of that in the book. I won't so much today in the talk today, but the fact that gender is overrepresented is an artifact of how communities take up this issue, which again stems back from that report. Okay, so to anchor my argument a bit, in these settings, materially, code is left open so that people can iterate it and modify it, potentially endlessly. This technical practice has implications for the governance of groups too. It means that if you are displeased with an aspect of the project you're in, you can hack it or you can fork it. Forking is, of course, a software term where you copy a code base and then build it in a new direction. And so I'm arguing that people are hacking their communities here, either adding lines of new code, metaphorically, or forking them and building them anew. And I'm asserting that this has led to interesting, but sometimes rather ambivalent outcomes. And I want to point out that a tension that arises here is, what if some members of a group don't want to split off from the dominant culture, but in fact wish to speak back to it, to hack in place? What if other members disagree and are fine with how everything is? And so we want to consider, what are the consequences of the emergence of these kinds of initiatives? What is really at stake in people coming together to hack? Why does it matter if all kinds of people can enter a space or a project? As groups brought governance and inclusion to the fore, some of this, perhaps ironically, became even harder to pin down. Okay, so I will give you just a split second on methods. This is an ethnographic project with sites in North America and Europe, and to a small extent, sort of tendrils out to other places in the world also, spanning about 2010 or 2011 to 2016. Participant observation, interviewing, online and offline settings, and taking a social worlds perspective here. Shared social world is a primarily discursive formation bound together by communication, but it also includes palpable matters like activities, membership sites, and organizations. Taking a social worlds perspective on this advocacy allows me to offer insights across multiple diversity projects. And so I'm going to argue that in spite of seeing similar patterns, the intentions of diversity advocacy are often rather inchoate, and this has consequences. So thank you for bearing with the preamble. I'm now going to dive into a few examples and vignettes from where people are wrestling with these ideas. And the first one, we will travel to Philadelphia in 2011. Some members of a hackerspace proposed an event to be held at the hackerspace, which was a hacking sex toys workshop. And what you're looking at is a design for a flogger made out of a bicycle tube. And the proposed event description read, if you like hacking and you like sex toys, then this is the event for you. From DIY floggers to vibrators that vibrate in Morse code, the possibilities are endless, end quote. So some members sent this around to the hackerspace over the listserv and said, we'd like to host this, and proposed a few dates. To their surprise, other members of the hackerspace actually reacted poorly to this suggestion, and rather than giving them a kind of pro forma rubber stamp that they had expected, really questioned whether this event belonged here. And here I quote one of the people who was concerned that this wasn't something that he wanted held in their space. And he says over email, a lot of the hackers here at the space are the Make Magazine Instructables type, not the Julian Assange Hope Conference, that's Hackers on Planet Earth, Hope Conference attending type, or even the kind that cares much about a global movement of hacker spaces. I'm not sure what category dildo hacking falls in. For a lot of people, DIY has to do with a sort of father-son nostalgia. And so in taking a close look at this quote, we can see a few things that are important analytically. One is he's very upfront about the fact that hacking is not monolithic. In fact, he identifies multiple different strands of hacking as a practice and as a political orientation. Nonetheless, he does draw a boundary and suggests that this proposed workshop, quote, dildo hacking, falls outside the boundary. It's beyond the pale. And he also marks not only gender, this masculinity, but masculine socialization of youth, the sort of father-son transmission of, practice and values. And so the implication, though it's not stated outright, is something that's centering sexuality and maybe even non sort of adult male heteronormative sexuality is questionable. Perhaps, needless to say, this resistance was very disappointing and upsetting to the people who had proposed the event, who didn't realize they were courting controversy. And one of them replies and says, so my concern here is that it's a hacker space. Initiative shouldn't be punished, particularly initiative that shakes up old patterns. Hackmake, that's a pseudonym, is really stratifying into hardware tinkering as the core interest and white males as the demographic. So I'm frustrated in the extreme right now, and I definitely don't want to flounce off because I can't host a particular event, but you can see how this is a culmination of concerns that have been building for months. So what happened here is that the members who proposed the workshop experienced this as a really stinging exclusion, and the group ultimately forked. The people who'd proposed the event and felt unwelcome went over to a new space that was in formation, and ultimately the event was held there. The whole experience, however, provided an opportunity for reflection internally and externally, and talking to me later in interviews. But one moment of this reflection is a year later at the aforementioned Hope Conference. There was a panel about, forking or staying to hack together, and panelists were sharing experiences. And someone from the Philadelphia hackerspace said this. He said, I left a hackerspace over frustration. I was trying to drag people into caring, but I felt that forking the group was better than changing the group. And that led to a lot of rich discussion. You can maybe are getting a sense already that there's a lot of, argumentation about best practices and ideals in these communities. But what I want to point out is his quote where he says he tried to drag people into caring. And I want to ask in a sort of sincere register as an analyst, what exactly are they supposed to care about? Again, we see these sort of concerns coming up with, the demographic coalescing as white males and a sort of bit of boundary policing around, father-son DIY nostalgia. So diversity is sort of flickering here, and it gets named. But really, like, what's at stake in this inclusion or exclusion is not named. And to think about this, I draw on Sarah Ahmed, who has pointed out that diversity as a value can, in her words, detach from scary issues such as power and inequality. And so I think actually what's going on here is this conflict in the hackerspace actually surfaced kind of tip of the iceberg about political exclusion as a constitutive feature in technology. So again, this is a very idiosyncratic argument that folks were having, but they're kind of stepping on a longstanding sort of structural exclusion in technology. And I want to suggest that diversity as a concept is maybe contributing to some of the problems here, because of sort of, it sets the terms of the discussion. And I think about this in the book, calling this a border of care, thinking about how boundaries are drawn, what's the problem, and then what interventions become possible based on how you've defined a problem. Okay, so moving on from that example to a rather different way of conceiving of some of these issues. This is a hacking group at the very beginning of setting up a feminist hacking space in Montreal in 2016. And one of their ideals for the space was to distribute, have people bring in machines that maybe didn't work anymore. We know that our machines are designed for obsolescence. And so their ideal was, if you had a computer that wasn't working, you could bring it in, they would refurbish it, put Linux on it, give it back to you. And in their words, their goal was recycling with partners that don't ship to dumps overseas, and trying to keep things in use, getting to zero waste or as close as possible, which we know would be pretty difficult in practice, but aspirationally, that's what they were thinking. And the reason why is that their collective is seeking to reposition computing as a social and material practice. And they're aware of the dirty and extractive conditions of electronics production and post-use. And they're hoping to divorce hacking, in which people take great pleasure in Montreal, from the exploitation of people in the global South and the environmental degradation upon which they know that their pleasure in Montreal is currently resting. So it's a very different gloss, but still coming up in a space where people are explicitly giving attention to sort of, power and inclusion and sort of patterns of, who's there and who's maybe invisibly excluded. Okay, one other example, actually back to Philadelphia. This is another little thing that happened on email. Unlike my earlier example, this one didn't cause conflict or controversy. You may not be able to tell what you're looking at, but that is a little one-winged UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle, little drone that fits in a backpack up top, that's modeled on the flight path of a maple seed in the bottom. And what this is actually from, it may look like a kind of amateur shot, but it's from a Lockheed Martin blog. And it's basically a publicity shot, but it kind of blurs a line, looking like a more amateur project, perhaps. And this was circulated over the email list. And one of the members says, look what this other guy's doing. Good job. And the context for that is that this hackerspace member who hacks on the weekend with the hackerspace is employed at Lockheed in the defense industry. And his, co-member of the space is celebrating this neat little thing that Lockheed did. And another person told me later how uncomfortable this had made her, but she didn't say anything about it in the space. She felt like she should be polite and, even affirming interpersonally if people were excited about tech projects that they were working on. And so even though I recounted a controversy in this space. That one was actually sort of an accident. People weren't trying to set off a fight and were surprised when one happened. But the person who was uncomfortable with this Lockheed celebration told me later in an interview in 2013, she said, these folks, others in the space, are generally not disciplined, appropriate technologists. So they're not aware of, much less trying to build around, the issues of communities who are victims of all the militarized stuff to begin with. And in reflecting thusly, she was speaking from her experience in Latin American countries. Some of her family is there, where she had spent time in her life working on community technology projects like water projects, solar power, and community radio, but in a context where US imperialism has caused a lot of harm. And she had an awareness of that. And of course, we know you don't actually have to leave the US to locate communities who are victims of militarized stuff. But again, some people are a lot more attuned to this than others. And if you note, the Lockheed email is from 2011, this quote is from 2013. Reason for this 2-year gap is another conflict sort of in the wider world in 2012 about Maker Faire, which is the O'Reilly sort of hacking festival, which a prominent hacker had boycotted in 2012 because Maker Faire had accepted sponsorship from DARPA, the Department of Defense. So that kind of cracked open a discussion about these issues, which had been, not explicitly sort of on the table in 2011 when that Lockheed post was sent around. But we're seeing here over and over in these examples, people recognizing that certain kinds of tech participation require or strongly encourage acceptance of status quo arrangements, that they're sort of, upon reflecting, concluding that they're maybe not so comfortable with. And people are trying in all of these examples to work through how they're positioned and how that affects what goes on in their hacking and software projects. And so, this leads me to ask, quite sincerely, if diversity is the answer, what is the question? I think some of what is coming up here are longings that are incompletely satisfied and frankly poorly matched to what diversity in tech is positioned to do. And I will assume at least some in this audience are familiar with work in the social studies of technology tradition that has bored down into the history of how technology is freighted with a legacy of division and has been actively constructed to help enforce a social order that elevates white, native-born Christian men as bearers and controllers of technology, and positions women, immigrants, colonial subjects, Black people, Indigenous people, and rural people on the receiving end of this social order in Euro-American and colonial contexts. And as work by Rayvon Fouché, Carolyn Marvin, Nathan Ensminger, among others, has shown, technology doesn't just reflect, but actively contributes to building and maintaining this social order. So when people in a hackerspace in 2011 are having this argument about hacking sex toys, while on the one hand, this is a certainly idiosyncratic example, and it might even seem a little absurd to someone outside of that space, I want to be really sympathetic to that and say that what's actually sort of going on here at core is that people are wrestling with a whole history, a legacy of division around tech participation. And I also want to point out that as tech has been imbricated with social power for so long, that especially in the analysis of people in techie communities, these concepts and ideas, technological participation and social power, become interchangeable. And so this is why tech and even down to the level of participation in a hackerspace, has become the domain for the expression of these political energies. That's why, an instance of exclusion is setting off, a whole sort of register beyond the immediate event. But what I'm arguing as an analyst is that I think we need to be very careful and disentangle abstract social goods from tech participation. And so that's, something sort of, I would say, speaking back to, these examples I'm giving. And I actually want to then zero in again on diversity, which I think is not really getting people where they intend to go. One, it draws focus away from structural problems, scary problems, which I think are sometimes really at the core of concern and care here, but not named as such. And second, and this is related, diversity is really a workplace value. And I don't have time to develop this a whole lot more other than to say, I think that bringing it into the hackerspace can wind up feeling wrong for a few reasons. One of them is, I think, people who don't want HR coming into their hacker spaces. They're coming into these spaces for, idealized forms of, sociality, and having HR come here kind of feels bad and confuses things. But I would say even more elementally, it leaves people with an underspecified value of what it is meant to add in these groups. So it can invite conflicts over participation and values, but it doesn't necessarily solve much other than perhaps opening up space for conversations, which I think is probably good, but maybe the conversations and analysis want to be deeper. And one of the things that diversity really does is it draws attention to representation, but maybe then draws energy away from other politics and values and longings that are coming up here. And we can see this pretty clearly with this example. So this is a name tag I was given at a reception sponsored by Google that was attached to one of these women in voluntaristic open tech communities convergences. And I'm juxtaposing it here with a TechCrunch blog post from 2012, which discursively will just, I think, be banal and very familiar. Someone writes, in my mind, the women in tech discussion should really be framed as having different people with different experiences and different outlooks helps you build a better product. And so this is some of what I think the discourse of diversity is doing and is meant to do. It's thinking about representation, it's maybe suppressing conversation about other values, and it's particularly oriented towards products and markets. And so again, it's not that diversity is bad, but it's maybe sort of toothless in terms of what people are actually interested in talking about in the hacker spaces. It can bring attention to patterns of social difference, but then it maybe draws people in less helpful directions for their aims. And I have another quote, this from sociologist Herman Gray, who says, abstract notions of rights and freedom and their expansion to new subjects elide the social salience of race and gender as a basis of inequality, even as it culturally recognizes and celebrates differences. So this is what's, I think, elementally going on with the celebration of diversity, which is maybe not well matched to hackerspaces. Markets are eager to absorb and then sell difference. But I don't think that this is what is primarily motivating folks in voluntaristic spaces. And adopting the same language can muddle what's at stake for them. We can see this illustrated in another way from an example outside of hacking, from a progressive policy NGO in the US. And I bumped into this quote right when I was finishing up this book, and I said, aha, this is, really clarifies so much. This is from Van Jones's Dream Corps organization. And they write in 2019, building up young people of color in tech so that we can finally tackle structural inequity and disparity in this critical industry is integral to the advancement of social justice in America, end quote. And so what I would respectfully submit is that this statement has the cart before the horse. Diversity in tech is actually a very limited strategy for claiming civil rights. We know from countless examples that add X kind of person and stir is not a guarantee for changing power relations. And more recently, we know that companies like Amazon and Microsoft are, very capable of putting up their Black squares for Black Lives Matter in 2020, but that didn't mean that they stopped building surveillance tools or working with ICE or law enforcement, right? So just having, people from underrepresented groups enter these tech firms may or may not, but I would suggest may not in and itself solve some of the more elemental problems of social justice here. Furthermore, and I think this is really important, thinking of these struggles happening primarily within corporate firms is a limited strategy. Not that those battles aren't important, but it can lead away from thinking about things like public ownership of technology, or even just in workplaces, non-commercial worker-owned co-ops or something. Overall, the relations within commercial firms and markets can inhibit conversations about coalitions across difference and very much sort of leave unquestioned all kinds of status quo arrangements. Again, outlining why the use of this language that's really about market relations is inhibitory in spaces that are not primarily oriented to market relationships. And in an interview, a Belgian designer said to me, corporate culture is about taking away tension, but FLOSS and hacking projects need to include difference. Tension is different from fear, which we don't want, but there's always misunderstanding, there's always awkwardness. Can we all have the space to speak and differ? End quote. And so if we sort of juxtapose this with diversity in tech as a discourse, we can see how diversity in tech potentially masks the conversations about values and politics that need to happen. That include scary problems, that include difference. And just from today's talk, naming racialized labor in a global political economy of tech work, or naming militarism, which are very controversial to name or contest in firms. But voluntaristic tech groups are, a different space. On the one hand, they're not positioned to take on the problems of structural inequality or a segregated society, but that's not really their shortcoming. I would posit that because they are not industry spaces or institutions directly related to markets or to nations who are concerned about economic competitiveness, they're really good places to work on articulating social critique. Some of it more radical, and some of it, bringing up and staying with these tensions. And so, before wrapping up, I'm going to give a few examples of spaces where this is maybe harder stuff, but less muddled. And one is, we can see this event flyer for feminist hacking convergence in Europe in 2014. And I don't know if you can read all the text, so I'll read it for you, but they say, gender hacking, anti-capitalism, libre culture, anti-racist, anti-sexist, gynapunk, DIY, DIWO, which is taking do it yourself and turning it into a more collective and communal, doing it with others. So again, that's sort of zeroing in on what's actually at stake and saying this is an ideal, in its ideal, this is a space to actually think about all of those registers of, inclusion and exclusion and power. Another example is that of feminist servers, which I heard about in an interview, and I was actually not sure at first whether I was hearing about a totally speculative object or something that really existed. But it's really a list of principles for rethinking the terms of association amongst people and machines. And I'll read you a couple of them, or a few of them. Feminist servers want networks to be mutable and read-write accessible. Feminist servers are autonomous in the sense that she decides for her own dependencies. Feminist server does not strive for seamlessness. The division of labor, the not so fun stuff, is made by people. That's a feminist issue. The feminist server treats technology as part of a social reality. And so this is, again, attempting to kind of recognize one's own emplacement in hacking and sort of name that, and then extrapolating outward, maybe name places for intervention or critique. I'll also add these turn out to be both real and speculative. There are feminist servers that are autonomously run by feminist techies to host content. Of course, they're not autonomous in the sort of full register idealized by like the Montreal Collective. Autonomy of hardware has not been realized. But, again, it's a lot of this, I think, is a kind of speculative realm that's really good for thinking with. And my last example along these lines is the crypto dance. And this is, again, a literal embodiment of some of these principles. Different way of trying to relate to tech and placing your body in the relationship self-consciously. This was a collectively improvised choreography of the Diffie-Hellman public key model in cryptography in Montreal in 2016. And this is in a kind of separate space, not necessarily meant to feed directly into mainstream hacking, but maybe you could think of it as a mutant strain. And people literally danced through the steps of the public key. So it's, again, literally people trying to think through how they're positioned and, doing that as a kind of disciplined practice to sort of open up conversations about power relations. So wrapping up, diversity advocacy in open tech exposes a complex interplay between hegemonic hacking knowledges and practices and others that begin to challenge and reconfigure the dominant social order. Technologists are involved in cultural mediation as much as technological production, always. Technology is, if not always already of the dominant culture, it's always laden with a legacy of division. And diversity advocates are recognizing these dynamics and challenging them, but often incompletely. Tinkering at the margins is important, but technology as a cultural edifice brings with it a weighty legacy of having been built to shore up the positions of elites and the powerful. And historically, mainstream hacking was maybe more implicated in this than it liked to admit or than it liked to discuss. And the final thought I have is that a focus on technology itself, or even on technical communities in relative isolation, may be confining to a social justice agenda. It might be possible to build more democratic technology. Undoubtedly, it is possible, and it is a good goal. But at the same time, emancipatory politics should never be limited to an exclusively technological realm. And so with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention. And I will put up the NSF boilerplate about how they don't necessarily endorse anything I'm saying. And I will love to hear questions and enter a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Yeah, questions if folks want to post them in the chat or raise your hand, I can call on you, whatever people feel comfortable with. I don't see any questions quite yet. People are probably still thinking. But I'll just ask you, I'm interested in kind of methodologically, kind of like how you, maybe your process for finding these strands, like as you kind of develop the research project and kind of what evolution was like for you.
That's a really good question. And excavating the process, I will say that this grew out of my sort of exposure to this phenomenon, was a kind of thread off my radio project, which you mentioned in the intro. Yeah, I will try to be brief, but basically I had done an earlier study that was ethnographic about radio activists, and one of their practices was, again, this emancipatory in their minds, teaching everyone to build electronics and solder. And this was supposed to be a kind of democratizing, everybody puts their hands on the tech kind of thing, and it sparks ideas about everybody having a claim to participate in the media system and whatever. In practice, they learned kind of the hard way that even though this was intended to be a very egalitarian practice, sometimes the way it shook out was that people with existing familiarity, which was likely to be patterned with race, class, and gender, as you might expect, were more comfortable with the tech. And so sometimes there would be kind of friction where newcomers would come and get put off, or activists would wind up kind of reinscribing, counter to their intent, would kind of reinscribe patterns of who was the most comfortable with and maybe in control of the tech. I hadn't thought that was going to be a very big part of that project, but it wound up being basically like a chapter. And it was kind of through that, some of those conversations, some of the people in that were also bringing their radio activism work into kind of hacking spaces. And so they weren't the same social groups, but they were in dialogue with each other. And so I learned about people in 2006, right after this EU finding came out, going to the Hope Conference to kind of confront the Hope Conference about this low rate of participation by women, and just kind of planting a flag about the issue. And so again, it was just kind of through having an ear open, I followed this thread. And then beyond that, it was, kind of opportunistic and snowball-y. And, it happened that during the period that I, had a grant and had time to be able to do field work, for instance, an NGO that was founded to directly be about these issues, hosted a series of events, and then shuttered and disappeared. So I was kind of there for the whole arc of that. There were a lot of feminist hackerspaces kind of in formation. And so, if I was traveling somewhere for work, I would try to sniff them out and get invited. And, was able to do some in the proximity to where I lived. I was in Europe for a fellowship, and there was a group in Amsterdam that had been sort of actively working on some of this stuff. And again, I didn't know anybody else in Amsterdam, and they took me, in. And so again, it was kind of opportunistic and not single site, unlike my earlier project. And so I can definitely say there were patterns and things nominally, disconnected from one another, but cropping up very similarly in different places. On the other hand, this is not a sort of deep look at a single space, and there, depending on what one was trying to look for, there would be disadvantages to that. But yeah, I was kind of following a lot of ribbons of discourse and practice, I would say, and opportunistic.
Right. All right. It's always fun to kind of have that journey through and just see these patterns emerging across many different contexts and time periods. Because you said you're kind of looking at from 2006 from that report to kind of the last few years, right?
Yeah, I want to say also that fieldwork really ended by 2015, 2016, and all of what I was looking at really coincided with the Obama administration. And I think that some of this is actually very affected by that political moment in ways that I might be able to sort of draw out even more clearly now, because I think there was a more kind of well, nobody would dare contest this, and we know we're sort of barreling along towards a more progressive future, and that record scratch kind of ends with the Trump administration. And literally like the Obama administration had a big push towards like women in STEM as part of like the national agenda. So I think people were actually maybe unable to fully articulate why this was a good idea because it just seemed like a thing that was consensed upon. Whereas, you know, with the Trump administration, we see these really, you know, revanchist, horrible things. Some of what's at stake and some of what also might have been missing becomes more obvious, I think. So I think if the fieldwork were even a few years later, conversations would look really different, you know, and by the time of, again, 2020, you know, the book's published, but people are really digging into, again, some of the stuff that I'm kind of surfacing a bit of, but was harder and more sort of evanescent during my fieldwork with, you know, militarism and racialized, you know, surveillance or racialized tech labor.
Great, thanks. I've got a couple questions here. One I'll answer. Diana Daly has a question, which I'll say, then we'll go to David, and then we'll go to Selena's question. So Diana asks, do you think there is space for acknowledging that some groups culturally have more experience with certain technologies while encouraging egalitarianism toward more effective collaboration? No, theoretically this seems possible, but in makerspaces, sometimes it seems there is a you can do itness that pretends that is not the case.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, again, some of this comes down to whether you're assuming there's a kind of like universal subject or whether you're not. And I've even heard people sort of do a 180 from saying, you know, I didn't want to patronize people, and I'm going to come up with, you know, gendered stereotypes, like hack your oven or sew a soft circuit or something, like maybe, you know, people who would express discomfort with, again, kind of reinscribing a gender stereotype, then realizing actually, if you want to onboard people, meeting them exactly where they already are is a good thing. But there's, I think, a lot of room to sort of sort through this and have people, you know, come to it from different competencies and different backgrounds. I even had somebody who was really generous with me in interviews tell me about how she found that hacking like aesthetic to be very culturally specific. And she was from a US background, but diaspora from Latin America and the Caribbean. And she is a woman. And she said, like, in my culture, people aren't wearing black and being like really somber and like, you know, looking like somebody out of the Matrix. And she really felt like this pressure to conform culturally. And I can, again, not place all of that in this book, but there's some really great work on hacking in different cultural contexts that's starting to happen. And I think all of that kind of is up for grabs. And maybe the first step is, you know, even surfacing and acknowledging some of the assumptions about, you know, what politics are here, what aesthetics are here, you know, and she was telling me this and she was like really laughing. Like she was sort of like, you know, it was funny, but it was also kind of cathartic to just say like, all of a sudden I felt pressure to wear a black hoodie and I did that all the time. And, you know, but these things actually kind of do matter in terms of, you know, these are subcultures. So signifying that you understand what's going on there, you belong, or that you're rejecting it and doing something new, like, you know, that's all real. So I don't know if that answered the question, but yes, I do get into some of that and it's a great question.
All right, David, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this is a really interesting talk, and it raises questions for me around, like in Tucson, there has been this proliferation of maker spaces that have opened. We have one in our department. We have a brand new one in the library, and I engage my students in projects making it there. There is I would say a significant amount of diversity in terms of like the interns who work there or the student workers who help people, you know, make projects. But I wanted to know, I mean, bringing up all of the kind of structural inequities that you're engaging and the whole history, like some practical examples of kind of addressing those. I mean, you put the flyer from Montreal, which is awesome, but there's also kind of the difference between kind of the academic and anarchist culture in Canada and Montreal specifically versus, like, let's say a hackerspace at a university in Arizona, or like specific research. So I'm thinking about strategies, like we have the hackerspace or the makerspace, and how to draw attention to some of these issues, or resources that I might be able to include in my class that would help guide a dialogue around, some of the issues without perhaps reading the whole book. I mean, it looks really awesome, but it's not going to happen for the class. So I guess like the practical things I'm asking, because the theoretical investigation is really compelling.
That's a great question. And as my caveat at the beginning was I wasn't going to give best practices because I think this is emergent and some of it depends on, again, what the goals of the specific space or group maybe are. But I will try to think about it. One of the answers I would give to, and one of the chapters in the book is about the introduction of, maybe you already have this, codes of conduct in spaces, which were kind of emerging, and then there was controversy, and then again it became something that like is not without controversy, but it has become quite widely practiced and adopted. And so I would think that not only having one, but giving participants an opportunity, maybe every semester or something, to like renew that contract with themselves and with one another, to sort of set out principles that they want to see in the space, and then think through how they would, not even view it as like enforcement or something, but like how they would enact them. I think that could be something that would be interesting. And there's actually, I'll try to remember to email to Zach afterwards. MIT has it's a bunch of open modules for computer science pedagogy, and I wound up writing something for them about codes of conduct. And so there's like classroom exercises about what a code of conduct is, what people, why they might want them, why they might not want them. But I think that they're a really interesting example of something a community can kind of set forth for itself. And again, it doesn't have to be like a HR coming in and handing down a list of rules. It can be like the exact opposite. It's like, this is the contract we want with each other, and this is like what we're really excited about making the space, and this is how we get there. And for a variety of reasons, like I'm probably going to keep coming back to these kind of like ways that groups try to enact the values and politics they've named for themselves at a pretty micro level. And so I think maybe just thinking through all that and like surfacing that, and then maybe you could have a renewable community code where you maybe again sort of talk about some of this stuff and draw boundaries for the group about what it wants to be. That might be, I don't know if that would work, but it might be interesting to try.
Yeah, well, it opens up that dialogue. If you could send that resource to Zach, that would be awesome, because I'm interested in including that in the course. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. I'll note it down. Okay. Great,
thanks. Yeah, we got a couple more questions left. Hopefully we can answer them in the last few minutes here. Selena asks, what differences have you seen with those who address technology and inclusion and equity with regards to race, class, and gender compared to inclusion and equity of those with disabilities?
That's a really, really good question. And I didn't write too much about that because in part it would have been maybe its own book, and to sort of do that well and to do justice to that, I can point to a few resources for thinking about that. And I will say that was like something that was coming up for some of these groups. And accessibility, and particularly in open source, is something that people have been, thinking about for a long time. This project didn't center that as much, but yeah, there are folks thinking about this, and yeah, one answer, I think her name is Elizabeth Elsesser. Might be getting her name wrong. I'm completely spacing. Jonathan Stern also has a new book about technology studies and disability. That might be sort of resources to point to. I want to say the first one is called The Promise of Access, but my brain is not always so good with recalling specific things correctly, but Elsesser. So yeah, I have a few sort of footnotes about that. And it was something I was sort of attuned to, and maybe even early on thought I would maybe try to write a chapter about, but the project got so big, and I also felt like, again, I would need to do more work to sort of nail that down. But your instinct that there is stuff there, and some stuff written about it is all correct. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, thank you for answering it. I do realize it was sort of a side question. And your answer for the previous question about community contracts, that gives me some good ideas. So thank you so much.
Yeah, my
Very
pleasure.
helpful.
Thanks.
So time for one quick question from Emily. To the extent that people in mainstream, predominantly white male hacking spaces are resistant to feminist framings of hacking, how to address this? Does this need to be addressed? Yeah, in 2 minutes or less.
Right. Well, okay, I can actually try to do this quickly. I made a decision in this book that there is a lot of documentation of hostile behavior and, conflict, and, that's kind of well known and well documented and well trod. And so I actually skipped a lot of that in this book. I just sort of made the decision that I was centering not the voices of people who were like, arguing with this. I gave enough of it to contextualize why my interlocutors were like thinking about the things they were thinking about. But you can't write about this without acknowledging that, without giving some examples and stuff. But I deliberately just excluded, giving, in a way, sort of giving air to the people who might oppose this, and said, if you will, there's enough diversity of opinion of people who are sincerely agreed that this is, something that they want to try to work out in their communities. And that's hard enough. That for people who are just sort of like taking a party line that, there's no problem here or something like that, I just skipped basically. And that's my, right as the analyst. There's a lot of literature though, if you're interested. Joseph Riegel has a fantastic paper title, which is like free as in sexist, I think, if you want to look that up. And there's a paper by Don Nafis called Patches Don't Have Gender, and sort of maybe looking at an earlier period before this became more consensus as a sort of problem, even if solutions were not readily forthcoming. Yeah, my book also gets into the final empirical chapter is sort of thinking about this as a variety of different problems of representation instead of the main axis that this sort of percolated up around, which was gender, and sort of thinking through some of that. So yeah, my book would have examples of that, but I actually just, I was more interested in talking to the people who are like trying to tend to the problems rather than, there's plenty of places on the internet where you can see people saying all manner of other things, some of it in, better and worse faith. And I skipped that. It's a good question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And we're about out of time, so I'm going to let everyone go. I know everyone's busy. It's Friday, so hopefully everyone has a great weekend. Thank you so much, Christina. Thanks everyone for coming out.